Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today on the Egora Experience program. I am your host, Cezary Jurewicz. Today I have with me Saeed Ahmed from the great nation of the United States. Now, Saeed is a retired psychiatrist and a recent Egora user. Please tell us a few more words about yourself, Saeed.
Hi, Cesari. I hope you're doing well. Thanks for the opportunity to do this. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Yeah, as Cesari said, I'm a retired psychiatrist. I do a few other things. I'm relatively new to this platform, so just trying to get my just sort of trying to figure this out. But looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. So am I. Now, for those of you who are completely new to the Egora experience, let me tell you real quick about what we do here. The International Logic Party has built a new kind of networking platform. It's called Egora, and it actually makes politics rational, efficient, and incorruptible. This thing gives ordinary citizens like us real political power. Through Egora, we can make our governments do what we, the people, need them to do. Now, on this show, Saeed and I will be using Egora to discuss some political issues and ideas that each one of us supports. And we want you to participate with us. So please register for Egora. The link is in the video description. Then search for both me and my guest Saeed. And then as we're having our discussion, if you agree with our ideas, you will be able to support our ideas by including them into your ideological profile in Egora. Here your voice has real power, and we want to hear you speak. Okay, Saeed, let's get started. We're going to discuss two ideas in the Egora, one from me and one from you. I will go first to kick things off. Now, round one. Now, this is a really big idea. It's about monetary policy, budget deficit, and government borrowing. So it has three sections. Just actually to give a quick preview of this for anyone listening, because I'm going to read the text of this idea. Essentially, the first section is saying that the amount of money should essentially be fixed in an economy. Section 2 is saying that governments should not be operating in deficit. And Section 3 is saying that the only proper source of funding for the government should be from taxes, not from borrowing from its own people or borrowing from other governments. So I want to read these three sections in detail here. All right, Section 1 about monetary policy. The amount of money, or hard cash, also known as M0, money zero, provided by a government to an economy shall be an amount that is fixed to the size of the population. Should the size of the population significantly increase or decrease, the amount of money will be adjusted through a popular referendum. In case of an increase of the money supply, the additional money will be distributed through equal disbursements to the population, citizens and permanent residents. In case of a decrease in the money supply, the money will be reduced by the destruction of the money assets held by the government. Section 2, the government, this is about budget deficit. The government shall not operate in deficit except in times of declared war or national emergency. Should the government do so, all of the incumbent elected office holders will become unelectable in the following election. Section 3, the only proper source of government financing is taxation, fees, and penalties. The government shall never seek to raise revenue by borrowing from within or outside of its borders. In the events of calamities and war, a nation must prepare for such by establishing good relationships with other nations in advance. So that's the idea. What do you think about this idea? Will you support it?
There are a few things here that I definitely agree with. I mean, it's setting up some good values, I would say. There are a few things I think we should talk about. First of all, you specify M0. Why M0? And what about some of those other M's? Are they completely off the table, or it's just that you didn't put them here?
That's a good question. I did not get into that. One is because it would make it more complicated, and I wasn't really ready to develop that idea to that extent, because the other M's I think they are, and this is actually interesting because the other M's, from my understanding, are not really up to the government. It's really up to the banks. So like when we're talking about fractional reserve banking, a bank will have a certain amount of deposits, and then it will give out in loans. Like, so it collects, yeah, maybe it has $1 million in deposits, and then it's up to the bank whether it wants to give out loans in the value of, 500,000 or 900,000 or only 100,000. Obviously, the more that the government, the bank can loan out, the more it can maximize its profits. But then if it's reserve, like if it loans out, 90% of its deposits and only keeps 10 in reserve, that might be sufficient. But if it gets down to like 1% in reserves, that makes that bank unstable. And I mean, it gives that bank an advantage overall in a stable economy. But if other banks are doing the same thing, that makes for a very unstable economy. And so the government has stepped in to say that that banks can only they must keep a certain amount of their money in reserves. And I don't know what that is right now in the US. I think it might actually be like 7%. And so that's the government saying, basically, that's the government controlling the supply of money by deciding how much the banks should keep in their reserve. And I can't say I've really taken a position on that. What I would say, I am kind of leaning in favor of the government actually not telling banks how much to keep in a reserve. I'm thinking that actually that should be up to the depositors, and to the stakeholders in that bank to decide how much it keeps on reserve. And I'm thinking that the bank should make that public, how much of its assets it's actually keeping in reserve, and that should give the consumers the knowledge to decide whether they want to bank with that bank or whether they want to do their business with another bank that will give them better security. So that's what I would say.
So I don't know if we want to pursue that point because that's not here, but one issue with that would be I would probably want to borrow from that bank. Like if a bank has very low reserve, like let's say a 0% reserve, I probably wouldn't want to put any money in that bank. But okay, so let's just stick with M0 for now. I guess the next point of clarification is population. There are two questions I have here. One is, how are you going to measure population, and how often? So, because that seems to be the key here, since you're tying it to population. So the methodology a little bit on that. And then secondly, are you defining that as sort of documented, or are you also including undocumented, which probably will exist in any, current state? So yeah, those two, I guess, would be my initial questions on that.
That's a good question. Well, I think if they're undocumented, that they don't really exist. So that's not. No, I mean that as a joke. But no, if you have a lot of undocumented people, well, I mean, you have to look at all kinds of other policies. Why are there so many undocumented people that they're affecting the money supply? In a way, it's actually a good thing. If you have all of these undocumented people, it's good for that economy because it's making the economy bigger, and which means there is higher demand for that money, which means that it's increasing the value of that money. And especially if there is such a thing as a universal basic income. See, all of these ideas, they fit in together with one another. I think a universal basic income, that this is something that's not often looked at, is that it can be a very effective immigration policy. Instead of controlling people at the border, whether they come in or not, you can control people through a universal basic income that's distributed only to citizens and permanent residents. And then if you are an illegal resident, then you don't get the universal basic income, which means, and this is good for a few different reasons, because one, I mean, it makes the legal residents richer. Frankly, that means you're working and you're actually contributing more to the people who have gone through the legal process, and you're contributing to that economy. But the other thing is, it's also freeing up that country to take in illegal residents, to people to participate in the economy, maybe basically have less border control. But that means that if people are really trying to escape a very dangerous situation or a very uncomfortable situation in their own homeland, and they're willing to come to a country where there is a universal basic income subsidizing the legal residents, but knowing that they will not be subsidized, that they will still, and they would still rather make that choice to abandon their former country, to go to a country that's going to have a higher cost of living. That means that, like, those people desperately need to leave that country, which we should be taking those people in. They will boost our economy, and we're going to be helping them in the process. Maybe eventually finding a way to make them legal also. So, like I said, the UBI has an important role in immigration policy, but it's also interesting how, with this idea, the additional money will be distributed through equal disbursements to the population, citizens and permanent residents. So if we're increasing the money supply, that would actually function a lot like the UBI. We're just actually giving out more money to the people, in order to increase the money supply. And of course, that money would go to legal residents. So does that answer your point, or
It does, I think. So I'm going to try to summarize. There are sort of two takeaways. One is that for this particular concept at the moment, I think we can take them off the table in a sense. But I think the other thing you raised is actually very interesting to me, and probably could be a whole separate discussion. But yeah, let's just assume that it's a population, and the money is distributed based on the way you said. Okay, so the next question I have is significantly increase or decrease. So the word significant, like, tell me some idea what that means, like 5%, 10%, 1%.
I don't know. You tell me. Let's decide.
What's your idea? Well, okay. So okay. So that's kind of an unknown at the moment. Let's leave that hanging for a second, because I'm going to come back to that. All right. Then we get probably to what I think is maybe in a sense, maybe the big thing which I probably have the most issues with is popular referendum. So, one of the things with money supply is that a certain amount of built-in flexibility for it to go up and down seems to be important to the economy for a variety of reasons. If you fix it and you require a popular referendum, the mechanics of the popular referendum then will influence how long it takes to increase and decrease. And I don't know enough about this to know, like, if that time delay becomes in itself a significant issue. Have you given that some thought?
Well, I mean, if you look at the amount of the population, we take a census in the U.S. Every 10 years. So, I mean, we wouldn't be adjusting the money supply except for every 10 years. So we wouldn't, I mean, okay, maybe we should do a census every 5 years. But then again, it's a monumental task to actually achieve that. So maybe it's better that it's every 10 years. And maybe it's better that the money supply doesn't change every 10 years. So, yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I think the bigger focus is on, frankly, the money supply shouldn't be changing that much. And I definitely don't think that it should be up to the government for its own policies, for its own purposes to do that. I'd like the government to actually step out of economics in that way for the most part. Just keep it fixed. It's only like over long periods of time. So after 10 years, if you had in the US, you had 350 million people, and now you have, instead of 350, now you have 360. That's a significant change. It's 10 million people. It's what is that? That's like 3% change in the population. Yeah. It's quite a bit. So you could print more money, because that's going to affect prices and to kind of stabilize it at a certain level. Yeah. So. Sorry, the rain started falling, and that made me lose my train of thought. So yeah, it's, anytime that you do something like that's when it should shift. But it certainly should not be as whimsical as controlling the money supply as it is right now.
Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize what my takeaways are here. So what you're talking about is a hard currency primarily, which is printed by the government, but after that, the government has very little say in its supply, except by popular referendum, which occurs relatively infrequently, so once every several years. And with that, it can go up and down a little bit, but for the most part, it's printed and it's kind of stays the same indefinitely, more or less. And all of this sort of back and forth of the money is between the citizens. Actually, there's one more question. So let's talk taxes for a second. Without getting into whether it's a flat or progressive, sales, let's assume there's some sort of tax. I assume you're going to have some sort of tax, right? Or is it okay? Yeah. Okay, so let's assume some sort of tax. So so some of the money goes into taxes every year, and then kind of comes back in government services, correct? And since it doesn't change, that would be the circular flow, right? Basically.
Well, it does change. I mean, different programs are. Yeah. Well, right. A lot of that stays.
The supply doesn't change; it's constant, right? So whatever goes into the government comes back out, and it has to happen. It can't really go up and down because the money is fixed, So.
Yeah. Well, like I said, that I don't know if it's M1 or I forgot what the classification, but so that money could potentially be changing. The money could be actually fluctuating based on on the fractional reserve banking. But I would expect for that to reach some kind of an equilibrium based on the consumer and investor confidence in the banks. That they would arrive at a natural equilibrium where people are satisfied. So yeah, the money should be fixed relatively. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that piece of it, because one of the things that's kind of absent here, I think consciously, because I think this is what you're trying to do, is to take away monetary policy, like the concept of a central bank and all of that. You want to sort of, seems to me like you want to remove that. But what you just said sort of lets us sneak back in through maybe a fractional reserve requirement. Maybe you want to take, and that's why I guess you were saying earlier that you want to take that away too. So I guess to me then kind of the big question is, why are you taking away monetary policy? Are you also taking away fiscal policy? I guess fiscal policy is still there. So you're just taking away monetary policy. Is that the...
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
And maybe at some point we should move into sections 2 and 3. So if you have questions, because that might tie things a little bit more together.
We can do that. I mean, we don't have to spend. So yeah, if you want to go into section 2 and 3, go for it.
Yeah, but the government shall not operate in deficit except in times of declared war and national emergency. So I think deficit spending is also, in a way, affecting monetary policy. I think that's also a part of monetary policy, and I think that should be controlled. And saying that, if the government is spending in deficit, all of the incumbent officers will become unelectable in the following elections. If you let the government go below the budget, everyone is out of their job, and we elect all new officials.
Yeah, I mean, to me, deficit spending is necessary often, actually. And the way you have it set up, it's sort of a moral hazard against deficit spending. Like, most politicians wouldn't want to do it because they would essentially be losing their job, assuming most politicians want to stay in their jobs, which seems to me like they do just based on their behavior. So, so I think the way you've got it set up is you're really discouraging deficit spending. And I guess you have these two out clauses, war and national emergency. The national emergency, as we've learned, can be sort of defined very widely. So I suppose if you're in a recession or a depression, would that count, or that wouldn't count as a national emergency? Like, what do you mean by national emergency?
Exactly. That's a good question. What is a national emergency? I mean, I don't know if it legally has any meaning. I think that's something that we should probably put a bit more thought into. Maybe it's some kind of a disaster. Yeah, that could be really tricky. I don't know, a meteor strike.
Well, that would be a national emergency. But how about just like a severe recession? Is that considered? Would that, or how about the 1929 depression?
We're not going to have those if we implement this monetary policy. And actually, if that was really created by the bank, the recession in the 1920s, that was really created through the terrible monetary policy. and fiscal policy of the government. It wasn't gonna get that bad. I'd recommend reading some Milton Friedman on that. You know,
No, I mean, okay, so we're going to get into some areas of which will probably take longer than we have time for today. But I think
and I just want to add real quick, and universal basic income, I think that would prevent us going into depression and maybe small recessions. But go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if this would do that. I mean, what this strikes me as is kind of, I mean, I have to go back and look at this a bit more, but this strikes me as the kind of policy that was in place in the 19th century in the US. In other words, there wasn't really a strong central bank at the time. There was a central bank, but it wasn't as strong. There was a sort of a natural cap on the currency. There was a gold standard, and deficits and surpluses didn't quite have the same sort of magnitude as they do now. And what happened was you did get many depressions. The one, the 20s was just one of them. There were many others in the 19th century. And, so I don't know if what you're saying is true. I mean, that's to me a question that, would require a little bit more historic analysis. I know that on the monetarist sort of tradition side, they do believe what you're saying, but I have heard other accounts as well for the Great Depression, which don't rely on just blaming it on the monetary policy. It has to do with certain other things that were going on in the 20s. Like, for example, one way you could get a depression that has actually nothing to do with the money would, like in a simple economy, if you have, crop failure, for example, then you would, like, all of a sudden, let's say you get a harvest that's 20 or 30% lower than what you would expect. And since you don't have, let's say, the same amount of flexibility, going to kind of your point about borrowing from other countries, let's say you really have to deal with whatever you have within your country, then that can cause a depression just by itself, without having anything to do with money. And if you have a fixed type of, money supply and the monetary tools are limited, the ability of the government to respond to that would be limited.
Right, but the government always responds to it in the wrong way. That's the problem. Frankly, the correct government response is no response. Let it fix itself, and that's exactly what it will do. Governments always make it worse. I mean, they're controlled by people who are not really. Okay, we are planning on taking over the government, so we are planning on making better decisions. But the better choice is to actually let things fix themselves. And especially when, again, this idea is in the context of all these other ideas that I have in my ideological profile. If you have the universal basic income, which they did not back then, and I find the universal basic income to be essential in making really capitalism work for everybody. So that would stabilize the economy so that it would not go into a depression, even in case of like you're saying, a 20-30% crop failure. It's still, or yeah, it's frankly the wealth disparity is really what's destabilizing the economy. That's the biggest destabilizing factor, I'd say.
Yeah, I think there are a few things you said which actually, I'm very sympathetic to, with the universal basic income, your comment about wealth inequality. I don't know if I agree with you about the analysis of government intervention. I think that's where we potentially have a core disagreement. I mean, to me, some of the things that, types of interventions and regulations that were put in place in the 30s have prevented the kind of booms and bust cycles that occurred earlier without those interventions. So while in the very long run, it might be true that things kind of take care of themselves, you can alleviate certain types of suffering by interventions if you do them the right way. It's not to say they're always done the right way, but I don't think you can take a theoretical dogmatic stance that they can never be done by the right way just because the government does it, that it always has to be the market. There's, a whole concept of market failures and market inefficiencies, externalities, all these things, and many others that, so go ahead.
Not to cut you off, but I mean, if you want a monetary policy, you call the UBI a monetary policy. If you're going into the recession, depression, the correct monetary uh, response is to have a UBI. You know, that's what the banks should have done. Not given, or excuse me, the Fed should have done. Not given more money to the banks. It should have given more money to the people who are creating the demand. So if you had a UBI to begin with, you would never have that, the depression to begin with, anyways. So I mean, I'm just saying that the concept, I think, of depressions, recessions will become obsolete with the UBI. It
Let's
will
say I
be so
agree with
stable.
90% of what you're saying, actually. I think your concept of UBI being really important in, alleviating suffering, the notion of giving more to the sort of the, people and not to the banks, institutions, and corporations, I totally agree with that. I don't know if I agree with the other ish point, which is that if you do that, you'll do away with depressions, and government should mostly step out of the way. I don't know if I'm ready to agree with that. I guess that's probably where the tension is still.
Well, here's the best way. Let's implement the UBI and find out how unnecessary it is to have any of these other monetary policy tools, which I'd still argue that, I mean, I'm not that knowledgeable about it, but from the records that I'm familiar with is that they tend to exacerbate the problem rather than make it better. And the rich benefit in the process. As that money moves, they know where that money is moving. They can anticipate those movements,
Yeah.
and they are the ones who are making big money from that, not the people. But real quick, so we have about 3 minutes in this half, and I just wanted to run this last section by you. The only proper source of government financing is taxation, fees, penalties. The government shall never seek to raise revenue by borrowing from within or from outside of its borders. So government borrowing, in the event of calamities and war, a nation must prepare for such by establishing good relationships with other nations in advance. So yeah, I'm saying that the government should not be borrowing money, like bonds, or if the government needs more money, raise the taxes, or lower your spending. If there is a disaster, well, you should just count on your neighbors being able to help you out, because if they won't help you out, maybe you're a shitty country and you should collapse. So
Yeah.
so again,
This
just
is,
about that.
yeah. I mean, again, I sort of, agree with some of the sort of basic reasons why you're going to some of these places. I think the technical aspects of these get kind of complicated. I'm not an economist, but I don't know if you can do that technically, what you're saying, and get the outcome that you want. I mean, but I'm definitely. I mean, I've sort of heard enough and read enough to know that the UBI piece definitely should be done. I don't know if you want to be so restrictive about the currency, like setting it, and some of these other sorts of restrictions on borrowing and all of that. That's the piece, I guess. It would take a little bit more convincing for me to get on board.
I got you. Well, we're basically almost at it. We got about a minute, so if you want to at least give this idea 0 points in your ideological profile, let's just say to keep it on a back burner, to keep you sharp, so maybe you can read up on this, or until you find a better idea. Have something, have some idea as a backup. If you're interested in that, maybe I can get you to at least give this idea 0 points.
Okay. I'm not here. I mean, I haven't been here long enough to know what that exactly means, but like, I mean, 0 points. So what does that mean? I support it, but at a zero level? What is it? Okay.
Right, right. It means it's a part of your philosophy, but you're not quite sure where that exactly fits in. I mean, it could mean a lot of things. It's up to you. It could also be a way for you just to hold on to some ideas, just to kind of keep thinking, mulling it over, it's to sleep on it.
Okay.
So maybe you're not an active supporter by giving it points, but you're still showing that you're thinking of in this direction. And it's up to
Okay.
you, like I said, what that means.
All right. I'll give it some thought.
And any closing thoughts that you have about this idea before we wrap up with round
No,
one?
I mean, I'm glad you sort of hit some of the main things. I mean, it's an intriguing concept, so I look forward to the next version. I'm sure, you're going to continue to improve it as you have these discussions. So good job.
All right. Thanks. So that's the first half of our show. This is the halfway point. We're going to take a break here and come back to discuss Saeed's idea in round two. So see you soon.